Hello, everyone. Tonight we are drifting back, way back, to a time when life was, shall we say, a bit more challenging. Imagine yourself huddled in a doorway, not because you're waiting for an early bird special at the local brunch spot, but because the wind, sharp as a tax collector's frown, is trying to burrow into your very bones. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp earth, and something vaguely unmentionable that you really don't want to investigate. You're cold, you're tired, and your stomach is performing a rather loud and unhappy symphony of emptiness. Tonight, we're delving into why it truly, deeply sucked to be a medieval thief. And a little heads up, based on historical odds, you probably won't survive this experience with all your limbs, or, indeed, your life, intact. Cheerful, I know. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. It helps the channel, and it helps me know you're out there, listening in the dark. Go ahead and post your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from across this strange and wonderful world of ours. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get going tonight. The rain has been falling for 3 days straight, a relentless, miserable drizzle that seeps into everything. It soaks your thin woolen tunic, a garment that has seen better centuries, let alone better years. You huddle deeper into the archway of what might once have been a grand building, but now just feels like another cold stone maw in a city full of them. Each gust of wind brings with it the clatter of loose shutters and the distant, mournful howl of a dog, probably as hungry as you are. Your stomach, oh, your stomach. It's a hollow, aching void. It's been so long since you had a proper meal, something warm and filling, that the memory itself feels like a half-forgotten dream. A stale crust of bread yesterday, water from a public fountain that tasted suspiciously of, well, let's not dwell on that. The water from public fountains, by the way, was a notorious source of dysentery and other rather unpleasant, often fatal illnesses. They didn't exactly have Brita filters back then. It was more of a hope for the best and try not to think about what the upstream tannery is doing kind of situation. You watch the occasional figure scurry by, cloaked and hooded, heads down against the rain and the gloom. No one meets your eye. Why would they? You're just another shadow, another piece of the city's grim furniture. A beggar, a wanderer, a soul on the brink, and the brink is where you are. The hunger isn't just an ache anymore, it's a constant twisting cramp that clouds your thoughts. It makes your hands tremble, your vision swim. Your stomach is so empty, it started echoing its demands like a particularly grumpy cathedral bell. It's a primal urge, this need for food, stripping away layers of what you thought made you, well, you. Morals, fear of God, fear of the law, they all seem to fade a little when starvation is staring you in the face. The thought, unwelcome at first, begins to take root, a tiny, insidious seed in the barren soil of your despair. Theft. The word itself feels ugly in your mind, heavy with the threat of consequence. You've seen what happens to thieves. The public floggings, the stocks, the hushed whispers about hands being removed. But then again, you've also seen people starve. Slowly, painfully, watched their skin stretch tight over their bones, their eyes sink deep into their skulls, and right now that seems like a far more immediate and terrifying prospect. The sheer precariousness of life in, say, the 14th century is hard for us to truly grasp. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for instance, decimated populations across Europe, highlighting how incredibly vulnerable everyone was to the whims of weather and harvest. It wasn't just a bad year, it was a catastrophic failure of the entire food system for millions. Imagine that level of desperation becoming the norm. For you, sitting in this damp doorway, historical statistics are cold comfort. Your reality is the gnawing in your gut. You think back to the village you left. Was it a good life? Not really. Endless toil in the fields for a lord who saw you as little more than livestock. But there was, usually, food, scant, plain, but present. Then the sickness came, or the lord raised the taxes, or a rival lord burned the fields. The reasons blur. All you know is you had to leave, hoping for something, anything better in the city. The city, however, has proven to be a cruel mistress. So many people, all clamoring for scraps, all equally desperate. You even heard a rather bizarre tale the other day about how some noble women used crocodile dung as a sort of sunscreen. Rich people, eh? Always with the weird fads, probably smelled delightful mixed with that general medieval aroma. Historians still debate whether most petty crime in the Middle Ages was driven purely by survival, or if elements of opportunism and social rebellion played significant roles. For you, in this moment, the debate is academic to the point of absurdity. Your motive is singular, to silence the growling beast in your belly. The city watch, the sergeants, they patrol, but their routes are predictable, and their enthusiasm for venturing into the darker, poorer alleys is famously lacking, especially on a night like this. They probably have a nice warm fire somewhere, maybe some mulled wine. You try not to think about mulled wine, or any wine, or warmth. A flicker of movement down the narrow street catches your eye. A merchant, by the looks of his slightly less ragged cloak, is fumbling with the lock on his shop door. He's alone. The shop probably has bread, maybe cheese. The thought is so potent, it almost makes you dizzy. This isn't a grand plan for riches, no cunning scheme worthy of a ballad. This is the last resort of a starving animal. You consider praying for a miracle, but the local saint seems to be on an extended coffee break, and has been for several decades if the state of the church roof is any indication. The air grows colder, or perhaps it's just the chill of the decision solidifying in your heart. You shift your weight, your stiff limbs protesting. The rain continues its relentless drumming, a soundtrack to your growing resolve, or perhaps your descent. The city is a maze of dark alleys and even darker choices, and tonight you're about to take a very definite turn. The merchant, muttering curses about rusty locks and incompetent apprentices, finally gets his door open and slips inside. For a moment, nothing happens. The street is empty again, save for the incessant rain and the echo of your own thumping heart. It's now or never. You push yourself up, your legs stiff and unwilling, like ancient wooden hinges. Each step is a monumental effort, a negotiation with gravity and despair. You try to move silently, but your worn-out leather shoes, or what's left of them, squelch miserably on the wet cobblestones, sounding, to your paranoid ears, as loud as a cathedral organ playing a jaunty tune about impending doom. Maybe not quite jaunty, but certainly loud. You reach the shop. It's a narrow frontage, tucked between a leaning tenement and what looks like a permanently closed abattoir, judging by the lingering metallic tang in the air. The door the merchant entered isn't quite latched. A sliver of yellow, flickering light escapes from within, along with the faint, almost unbelievably tantalizing smell of baking bread. Or perhaps it's just stale bread, but to your deprived senses, it's the aroma of paradise. Your hand, slick with rain and trembling, reaches for the door. It feels heavy, impossibly heavy, as if the weight of all your potential future misery is already resting upon it. You nudge it open, just a crack. Peering inside, you see a small, cluttered space. Shelves laden with sacks of grain, some pottery, a few dusty bolts of cloth. The merchant, his back to you, is hunched over a counter, likely counting his meager takings for the day, or, knowing merchants, possibly just admiring his own reflection in a polished pewter plate. It's now or, well, still now. Taking what feels like your last normal breath, you slip inside. The air is warmer here, and the scent of bread is stronger, making your head spin. There, on a low shelf near the door, a small round loaf sits unguarded. It's not much, perhaps a day old, but it looks like the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. Worth risking everything? Apparently so. Your movements are anything but graceful. You're no master thief from a fireside tale, no nimble rogue who can pluck a purse from a belt without a sound. You're just hungry. You shuffle forward, your eyes darting between the bread and the merchant's back. Each creak of the floorboards under your feet sounds like a thunderclap. You reach for the loaf, your fingers clumsy with cold and anticipation. Just as your fingertips brush the rough crust, the merchant clears his throat. A loud, phlegmy sound that makes you jump as if prodded with a hot iron. He turns, slowly, and sees you. For a heartbeat, neither of you moves. His eyes, small and shrewd, narrow as they take in your ragged appearance, your desperate lunge for his property. Your heart seems to stop, then hammers against your ribs like a trapped bird. There's no witty explanation you can offer. "Oh, terribly sorry, thought this was the bread-tasting emporium. My mistake, cheerio." It just wouldn't fly. Then his face, which was merely surprised, contorts into a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. "Thief!" The word explodes from him, a cannonball of sound in the small shop. "Thief! Guards! Help! Thief!" Panic, cold and absolute, floods your system. You don't even have the bread. Your hand recoils as if burned. You turn to flee, but you're as graceful as a drunken bear on ice. You stumble, knocking over a small stack of pottery that shatters on the floor with an expensive-sounding crash. Oops. Add property destruction to the list. The merchant is already moving, surprisingly fast for a man of his apparent girth, grabbing a heavy wooden cudgel from behind the counter. He looks like he's been waiting his whole life for this moment, like he's got a monthly beat a thief quota to meet. You scramble for the door, the merchant's roars of "Stop, villain!" echoing behind you. You burst back out into the rainy street, not with a prize, but with pure terror propelling you forward. But it's too late. The merchant's cries have already done their work. Heads are appearing in windows. Doors are creaking open. From the end of the street, you hear the heavy thud of running feet and the clank of metal. The watch. Or perhaps just civic-minded and rather angry citizens. It was not uncommon in medieval towns for bystanders to be legally obligated to join in the pursuit of a suspected criminal once the hue and cry was raised. This was a system known imaginatively as the hue and cry. Failure to participate could actually result in a fine for the non-participating citizens. So, that shopkeeper screaming his lungs out, he wasn't just being dramatic. He was kicking off a community-led, legally sanctioned manhunt with you as the star attraction. You, the person who just wanted a nibble of bread. You sprint, or rather you splash and stagger, down the nearest alley. It's a dark, narrow passage filled with overflowing refuse and smelling powerfully of stale beer and regret. Your lungs burn, your side aches. You can hear shouts behind you, getting closer. "There he goes! Into the rat's nest!" Charming name for an alley. Probably earns its keep. The footing is treacherous, slick with mud, and things you don't want to identify. You slip, catching yourself against a slimy wall, the rough stone scraping your hand. Historians still debate the efficiency and fairness of such immediate communal justice. On one hand, it could act as a swift deterrent. On the other, it often led to misidentification and mob violence, with little room for due process or, figuring out if someone was just admiring the architectural features of a shop from a slightly too close vantage point. For you, the debate is less pressing than the sound of heavy boots closing in. You risk a glance back. Two burly figures, one with a rusty halberd, are gaining on you. There's nowhere to go. The alley is a dead end, blocked by a high stone wall, probably the back of some more fortunate person's house. Trapped. Like a rat, indeed. You turn, panting, to face your pursuers. The first one, a large man with a tangled beard and the enthusiastic gleam of someone about to mete out some good old-fashioned justice, grins unpleasantly. "Well, well, what have we here then?" he rumbles, his voice like stones grinding together, a little shop rat trying to scurry away. Before you can utter a word, a plea, a denial, anything, a fist connects with your jaw. The world explodes in a flash of white, then goes dim. You stagger, your knees buckling. Another blow, this time to your stomach, knocks the air from your lungs with a sickening whoosh. You fall to your knees in the mud and filth. Medieval summary justice, it turns out, is a lot less summary and a lot more ouch. Oddly enough, while they were quite keen on apprehending thieves, forensic science wasn't exactly a priority. Fingerprints, DNA, they were more likely to rely on a witness pointing and saying, "That's him. I saw him take a suspiciously long look at my prize-winning turnip." No, tonight there are no forensics, only fists and the hard, unforgiving cobblestones meeting your face. The merchant arrives, puffing and wheezing, cudgel still in hand, looking rather pleased with himself. Your brief, inglorious career as a medieval thief seems to be over before it even really began. And the bread? Still in the shop. So much for a midnight snack. Your head is ringing like a cracked church bell. The world swimming in and out of focus. The mud of the alley floor is cold and disgustingly soft beneath your cheek. Someone is roughly hauling you to your feet, strong hands gripping your tunic, bunching the damp fabric painfully tight. You try to speak, to protest your innocence. Well, your relative innocence. You hadn't actually stolen anything yet, just committed a very enthusiastic act of intent, but all that comes out is a groan. The taste of blood and alley filth fills your mouth. So much for that sophisticated debate you were planning on having about the socioeconomic factors leading to petty crime. You're dragged, rather than walked out of the rat's nest, back onto the slightly wider, but no less grim street. A small crowd has gathered, their faces pale and indistinct in the flickering torchlight that one of your captors now holds aloft. They stare with a mixture of curiosity, contempt, and perhaps a grim sort of satisfaction. It's entertainment, isn't it? A bit of drama to break the monotony of a wet, miserable night. You're the star of tonight's unfortunate show. There's a distinct lack of paparazzi, though, which is a small mercy. You wouldn't want this look immortalized. The streets of a medieval town at night are a different beast entirely from their daytime incarnation. During the day, they might bustle with commerce, with vendors hawking their wares, children playing, and the general organized chaos of medieval life. But at night, that's when the shadows lengthen and deepen, not just metaphorically, but literally. Street lighting, as we conceive of it, simply didn't exist for the vast majority of people or places. Wealthy households might hang a lantern outside their door, and some major thoroughfares in larger cities could have ordinances requiring citizens to do so. But these were exceptions. For the most part, once the sun went down, the urban landscape plunged into an inky blackness, broken only by the moon, if it was out, or the occasional glimmer from a window. Torches were expensive, and fire was a constant, terrifying hazard in tightly packed wooden towns, so indiscriminate use of open flames was heavily discouraged. One historical fact: curfews were common in many medieval towns, often signaled by the ringing of a bell, the couvre-feu, or cover-fire bell, after which people were expected to be indoors and their fires banked for the night. Wandering about after curfew without a good reason was highly suspicious. You, currently being frog-marched by two angry men, definitely count as highly suspicious. So you're stumbling through this oppressive darkness. Your captors, familiar with the route, navigate with a certainty you can only envy. You, on the other hand, trip over unseen obstacles. A loose cobblestone here, a discarded piece of refuse there, maybe even a sleeping pig. Pigs and other livestock were often allowed to roam freely in medieval towns, acting as a sort of ad hoc and highly unsanitary waste disposal system. Just imagine the smell, especially on a warm day. You probably stepped in something you'll regret for weeks. Actually, given your current predicament, your regrets list is probably quite long, and pig mess on shoe is fairly low down. The streets are narrow, winding, and unpaved in many areas, turning into muddy quagmires after rain like tonight's. Buildings jut out at odd angles, their upper stories often overhanging the street below, creating claustrophobic canyons that block out what little light there might be. These overhangs, known as jetties, were a way to maximize a building's upper floor space without encroaching too much on the narrow street at ground level. Clever, but it made the streets below even darker and more, drippy, especially when the privies were often located in these overhanging sections. Yes, you read that right. Medieval plumbing was rudimentary at best. Waste was often just tossed out of windows into the street below or into cesspits that frequently overflowed. So that drip, 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 you hear? It might be rain. It might be, something else. It's best not to think too hard about it. The phrase gardeloo, shouted before emptying a chamber pot from an upper window, supposedly comes from the French gardez l'eau, watch out for the water. Charming. You pass a dark, silent church, its stone bulk looming like a sleeping giant. Further on, the glow of a blacksmith's forge, banked for the night, but still radiating a faint warmth, and the smell of hot metal and coal smoke. There are no friendly neighborhood watch signs, no well-lit convenience stores. Just dark doorways, silent windows, and the ever-present sense of unseen eyes. Every rustle in a darkened alleyway, every distant shout could be trouble. And tonight, you are the trouble, or at least the one in trouble. The odds of encountering danger on these streets were significant, even if you weren't actively being pursued. Aside from other desperate souls looking for an easy mark, there were wild dogs, uneven footing leading to nasty falls, and the simple, pervasive threat of getting completely and utterly lost in the maze of unlit, unmarked streets. Historians still debate the actual level of everyday violence in medieval cities versus the perception fueled by surviving court records, which, by their nature, focus on crime. Was it a constant bloodbath, or were most nights quiet, with crime being the exception? The truth likely lies somewhere in between, but for someone in your position, the perceived threat is just as potent as the real one. Your captors are grumbling about the cold, the rain, and the general inconvenience you've caused them. One of them shoves you forward. "Move it, scum! The sergeant-at-arms will want a word with you." The sergeant-at-arms? That sounds official. And not in a good way. Not like official supplier of cozy blankets and warm tea. More like official administrant of painful experiences. You wonder, briefly, if you could make a break for it. Try to lose them in the labyrinthine alleys. But your legs feel like lead. Your head is still throbbing, and the man with the halberd looks like he'd quite enjoy the chance to use it. Discretion, or perhaps just exhaustion, seems the better part of valor. For a delightful, off-topic bit of trivia, in some medieval towns, if a pig was found guilty of a crime, like, say, attacking a child, it could actually be put on trial, complete with lawyers, and even executed. Yes, animal trials were a thing. Perhaps you could plead that you were merely channeling your inner mischievous piglet. Probably not. The grimness of the city at night is matched only by the grimness of your prospects. There's no easy way out of this. You're cold, you're wet, you're injured, and you're being dragged towards whatever passes for medieval justice in this particular corner of the world. The flickering torch casts long, dancing shadows, making familiar shapes seem monstrous and threatening. Every dripping eave, every shuttered window seems to accuse you. The city, which earlier seemed indifferent to your plight, now feels actively hostile, a web of stone and shadow designed to trap you. And as you stumble onward, the only certainty is that the night is far from over, and it's probably going to get a lot worse before it gets any better. If, indeed, better is even on the menu. Your enforced tour of the city's nocturnal highlights continues, each step a miserable squelch, each breath a painful reminder of your recent, rather enthusiastic introduction to citizens' justice. The man with the halberd prods you occasionally, just to keep things moving, a sort of medieval cattle prod, if cattle were being herded towards an uncertain, but almost certainly unpleasant legal entanglement. You begin to contemplate the tools of your chosen, albeit spectacularly failed, profession. What does a medieval thief even use? You didn't exactly have a Thieves R Us superstore to pop into for the latest lock-picking kits or glass cutters. If you were a more accomplished ne'er-do-well, perhaps aiming higher than a slightly stale loaf of bread, your toolkit would be pathetically crude by modern standards. There were no sonic screwdrivers, no thermal lances, no tiny little cameras on flexible stalks. If you wanted to get through a door, your options were generally brute force, or slightly more cunning brute force. A good stout crowbar or a piece of flattened iron that could serve as one was a thief's best friend. Something to pry open a stubborn window shutter, to force a poorly made lock, or even to lift a heavy cellar door. These weren't precision instruments. They were chunks of metal probably stolen from a blacksmith's scrap pile or found by the side of the road. No one was engraving their initials on their favorite jemmy. Locks in the medieval period were, for the most part, relatively simple affairs. Warded locks were common, relying on internal obstructions, wards, that a correctly shaped key would bypass. A determined thief might use a set of skeleton keys, basically bits of wire or specially filed keys designed to push past common ward patterns. Making these would require some skill and access to metal and tools, so they weren't exactly beginner equipment. You might try picking a lock with a thin piece of wire or a specially shaped hook, but it was a fiddly business, best done by someone with steady hands and a lot of patience. Qualities you suspect you are currently lacking, what with the adrenaline and the throbbing head. Historians still debate the prevalence of truly skilled lockpickers versus the much more common method of just kicking the door in or climbing through an unsecured window. Common sense suggests the latter was far more frequent. Burglary was often less about finesse and more about opportunism and a willingness to break things. Another tool might simply be a sturdy sack. If you're planning on liberating goods, you need something to carry them in. Not exactly high-tech, but essential. For climbing, perhaps a rope, if you could get one. Good rope was valuable, though, not something left lying around. More likely, you'd be relying on your own agility, scaling low walls, or shimmying up drain pipes, which, considering what went down them, was a deeply unappealing prospect. You probably wouldn't be sporting specialized climbing gloves, more like hoping your calloused hands didn't slip on the damp stone. Think about windows. Glass was an expensive luxury for much of the Middle Ages. Many, if not most, windows in ordinary homes wouldn't be glazed, but covered with wooden shutters, or perhaps translucent sheets of oiled parchment or horn. Shutters could be pried open. Parchment or horn could be cut or pierced. If there was glass, it would likely be small, leaded panes. Breaking one quietly would be tricky. Maybe you'd try to pry out a whole section of the leading. Again, not subtle. It makes you wonder how anyone ever managed a stealthy entry. Perhaps most medieval break-ins sounded like a wardrobe falling down a flight of stairs, which, come to think of it, might have blended in with the general nightly cacophony of a medieval city. Let's not forget the simplest tool of all, darkness. Your primary ally would be the night itself, the cloak of invisibility it provided. This is why curfews were so important to town authorities. Anyone out and about in the pitch black was, by default, suspicious. One authoritative historical fact: some medieval laws actually differentiated between crimes committed during the day and those committed at night, with nocturnal offenses often being treated more severely because they were seen as more premeditated and harder to detect. So, your little bread-snatching adventure, had it occurred in broad daylight, might have been viewed slightly differently. Probably not much differently, but hey, every little bit helps when you're facing medieval justice. For the more specialized thief, say a pickpocket working a crowded market, the tools were nimbleness of finger and misdirection, perhaps a small, sharp knife to cut a purse string. Purses were often worn on belts, making them tempting targets. The cut purse was a well-known figure of ill repute. It's funny, the term pickpocket sounds almost gentle, like they're just selecting a pocket, whereas cut purse has a much more direct and slightly more violent ring to it. Gives you a little shiver, doesn't it? As an odd or off-topic fact, it's said that some elaborate medieval coin purses had bells attached to them, precisely to deter cut purses. a sort of medieval car alarm for your cash. One wonders if thieves then specialized in bell-muffling techniques. And then there were the less tangible tools, information. Knowing the layout of a house, the habits of its occupants, when the watch patrolled a certain street, these were invaluable. This information might be gleaned from careless talk overheard in a tavern, or perhaps from a disgruntled servant. A bit of local knowledge could be worth more than the best crowbar. You, however, had none of that. Your intelligence network consisted of your rumbling stomach and a vague hope that the merchant wouldn't turn around too quickly. Spoiler, he did. Right now, as you're being hauled along, the only tool you possess is a growing sense of dread. Your captors are not exactly treating you with kid gloves. They don't seem concerned about preserving evidence or your civil liberties. It's a far cry from a modern arrest, with its Miranda rights and careful handling. This is more rustic, more grab and drag. They probably figure that if you look like a thief and you were found in suspicious circumstances, then you're probably a thief. Medieval profiling at its finest. Perhaps they'd offer you a nice cup of tea and a biscuit if you just confessed to trying to abscond with the crown jewels while you were at it. Doesn't seem likely. The toolkit of the authorities, you suspect, is about to be deployed against you, and it's likely to be considerably more robust and considerably less concerned with your comfort than your own pathetic imaginary collection of bits of wire and a strong sack. The path ahead is dark, both literally and figuratively, and the only certainty is that the tools you lacked for your crime will be nothing compared to the instruments of justice, or what passes for it, that await. You hear it before you see anything clearly through the haze of pain and rain, a rising cacophony of shouts, a confused clamor that cuts through the night. It's not just your captors now, or the distant city noises. This is something more immediate, more focused. As you're roughly pulled around a corner, the source becomes apparent. More people, alerted by the initial commotion and the merchant's piercing cries of "Thief! Thief!" are joining the unhappy little procession. This, you realize with a sinking feeling, is the infamous hue and cry in full, glorious, terrifying swing. It's like a flash mob, but instead of synchronized dancing, you get communal condemnation and the distinct possibility of being kicked a lot. The hue and cry was a cornerstone of medieval law enforcement, such as it was. It wasn't a centralized police force responding to a dispatch. It was a societal obligation. If a crime was witnessed, or if someone was suspected of a felony, the witness was legally bound to raise the alarm, literally to cry out, and all able-bodied men within earshot were expected to stop what they were doing and give chase. As mentioned, failing to join the pursuit could lead to a fine or other punishment. It was a system designed to mobilize the community itself as the first line of defense against criminals. Think of it as a medieval neighborhood watch program, but with more shouting and a higher chance of someone wielding a pitchfork. Less about cookies and bake sales, more about apprehending scoundrels. So here you are, the unfortunate quarry. The crowd swells, faces appearing out of the darkness, illuminated by the occasional flickering torch or lantern someone has hastily brought out. They are a mix of ages and types, shopkeepers still in their aprons, a burly smithy type wiping his hands on his breeches, even a couple of bleary-eyed apprentices who look like they were rousted from their beds. Their expressions range from angry to excited, to grimly determined. You are the focal point of their collective outrage, and, let's be honest, probably a bit of their boredom. It's not every night you get to chase down a miscreant. It beats listening to the rain anyway. "There's the villain!" shouts one. "Grab him tight, lads," calls another. Someone pokes you in the ribs with a stick. Not hard enough to do serious damage, just enough to be insulting and painful. The feeling of being surrounded, of being the object of so many hostile eyes, is suffocating. There's no anonymity here, no chance to slip away unnoticed. You are marked, identified, and thoroughly, utterly caught. Each new face in the crowd is another accuser, another potential dispenser of rough justice. One particularly enthusiastic fellow, brandishing a cooking pot lid like a makeshift buckler, shouts, "Did you see him? Tried to rob old man Gildas, he did. Right brazen, in his own shop." News travels fast in a small, interconnected community, especially bad news, and especially news that involves a bit of drama. You suspect your attempted theft of a single, slightly past its prime loaf of bread is already being embellished into a daring raid on the town treasury. People love a good story, even if it's at your expense. Or, perhaps, especially if it's at your expense. It's like medieval social media, but the likes are angry glares and the shares are exaggerated eyewitness accounts. An authoritative historical fact. The Statute of Winchester in 1285 formally codified the system of watch and ward and the hue and cry in England, making these communal policing duties a matter of national law. It reinforced the obligation of all men to keep arms appropriate to their station and to participate in pursuing felons. So this isn't just local custom, it's the law of the land kicking into gear, albeit in a very messy, grassroots sort of way. You're not just up against a couple of disgruntled citizens, you're up against a legally mandated mob. Wonderful. The sheer noise is disorienting. Shouts, accusations, the clatter of feet on cobblestones, the occasional bark of a dog joining in the excitement. You try to shrink into yourself, to make yourself smaller, invisible, but it's no use. You're being propelled forward, the crowd acting as a current, sweeping you along towards, well, you're still not entirely sure where, but it doesn't feel like it's going to be a tea party. The original merchant, Gildas you now presume, is at the forefront, still red-faced and panting, but with a triumphant glint in his eye. He's the hero of the hour, the man who defended his property and raised the alarm. He's probably already planning how he'll recount this story in the tavern later, adding a few embellishments about your monstrous size and cunning. You'll be 7 feet tall and breathe fire by the time he's on his third ale. Historians still debate the effectiveness of the hue and cry in actually reducing crime versus its role in reinforcing community solidarity through collective action against perceived wrongdoers. Did it scare potential criminals straight, or did it mostly just catch the slow, the unlucky, or the falsely accused? For you, pinned in the middle of this righteous rabble, the academic distinction is somewhat moot. It certainly feels effective in making your life miserable right now. The pressure of the crowd is immense, not just physically but emotionally. It's a tangible wave of disapproval and hostility. You feel very, very alone. Oddly, you recall a story your grandmother used to tell about a goose that was once paraded through her village with a sign around its neck, detailing its crime of stealing shiny buttons. Apparently the goose looked deeply ashamed. You wonder if you look as ashamed as that goose. Probably more so, given the stakes. A goose probably wouldn't lose a hand, hopefully. Medieval animal trials notwithstanding, poultry generally got off lighter than humans. You also wonder if anyone in this crowd ever considered the possibility that maybe, just maybe, people driven to snatch a loaf of bread aren't inherently evil, but perhaps just desperately hungry. It seems like a nuanced thought that is decidedly not on the agenda for tonight's festivities. "Hang 'em!" someone bellows from the back, a little prematurely, you feel. They haven't even gotten to the formal accusations part of the evening yet. The experience is terrifying. There's no single authority figure in control here, just a collective will, a tide of angry citizens. The potential for things to escalate, for the crowd to take matters into their own hands before you even reach any official custodian, feels very real. You've heard stories of thieves being beaten senseless, or worse, by angry mobs who decided to bypass the legal process altogether. Right now, your fate feels very much in the hands of this swirling, shouting mass of people, and their mood does not seem to be leaning towards leniency and understanding. The rain continues to fall, mingling with your sweat and the general miasma of the medieval street, a fittingly miserable accompaniment to your public humiliation and terrifying journey into the heart of communal justice. The impromptu parade, with you as its unwilling guest of honor, finally lurches to a halt. You're shoved through a heavy wooden door, the shouts of the hue and cry fading slightly behind you, though you can still hear their excited murmurings outside. The air inside is instantly different, colder, damper, and thick, with a smell that makes the alleyways you just traversed seem like a field of wildflowers by comparison. It's a miasma of unwashed bodies, stale straw, human waste, and utter soul-crushing despair. Welcome to the jail, or, as we might say, jail. Though jail somehow sounds more appropriately grim, doesn't it? Like it's already got a bit of suffering baked into the spelling. This isn't a neat, orderly police station booking room. There's no desk sergeant taking down your details, no offer of a phone call. Instead, you're thrust into a small, dark space, the door slamming shut behind you with a sound of utter finality, the heavy thud of a bolt sliding home echoing in the sudden quiet. Your eyes struggle to adjust to the gloom. A tiny, barred window, high up in one wall, lets in a sliver of gray, pre-dawn light, doing little to illuminate the oppressive darkness. The floor is packed earth, uneven and damp. In one corner, there's a pile of something that might be straw or might be the fossilized remains of previous unfortunate occupants. You decide not to investigate too closely. The conditions in medieval jails were, to put it mildly, atrocious. They weren't primarily places of long-term punishment as they often are today. Instead, they were holding pens designed to keep accused individuals, like you, confined until their trial, or until they could pay a fine or debt. There was little to no provision for the inmates' welfare. Food and water, that was usually up to your friends or family to provide, if you had any, and if they were willing or able. If not, you starved, or relied on the occasional meager and often rotten charity of the jailer. Bedding, see the aforementioned pile of dubious straw. Sanitation, you're kidding, right? A bucket in the corner, if you were lucky, emptied infrequently. The stench alone was a form of punishment. You try to breathe shallowly through your mouth, but the taste of the air is almost as bad as the smell. You're not alone. As your eyes slowly acclimate, you discern other shapes in the darkness. Huddled figures wrapped in rags, shifting restlessly. A cough, wet and rasping, echoes from one corner, a low groan from another. These are your new roommates, the fellow unwilling residents of this miserable establishment. They don't greet you. There's no welcoming committee for the local dungeon. Just a shared atmosphere of misery and apprehension. You can feel their eyes on you, sizing you up, perhaps wondering what petty crime or grave misfortune brought you to this delightful subterranean holiday spot. Maybe they're taking bets on how long you'll last before you start screaming. It's not exactly the Ritz, is it? More like the pits. The jailer, the man in charge of this fine establishment, was often not a salaried official in the modern sense. His income frequently came from fees extracted from the prisoners themselves, for food, for drink, watered-down ale if you could afford it, for Nemnoga better conditions like more straw, or even for the irons they might be forced to wear. So, if you were poor, like you are, your stay was likely to be even more wretched. One authoritative historical fact: imprisonment for debt was common, and debtors could be kept in jail for extended periods, their conditions often deteriorating as their ability to pay for basic necessities dwindled. Some jails even had different sections, with wealthier prisoners able to pay for slightly less horrific conditions, perhaps a private cell or better food. You, having failed to even secure a loaf of bread, are definitely in the budget section. The bring your own everything, including hope section. You slide down the damp wall, your legs finally giving out. The cold of the stone seeps into your bones, a deeper chill than even the rainy street outside. Your head still throbs, a dull, persistent ache. You touch your jaw gingerly. It's already starting to swell. You think about that merchant, Gildas. You hope he's enjoying his bread. You hope it gives him indigestion. It's a small, petty thought, but it's something to cling to in the overwhelming despair. Disease was rampant in these places. Jail fever, likely typhus spread by lice, was a notorious killer, often more deadly than the executioner's axe. Overcrowding, lack of sanitation, and poor nutrition created a perfect breeding ground for all sorts of unpleasant illnesses. Sharing your confined space with vermin, rats, lice, fleas, was a given. You can already feel things crawling on your skin, or maybe it's just your imagination running wild in the dark. An odd or off-topic fact: medieval people had some interesting ideas about hygiene. While personal cleanliness was valued by some, the concept of public sanitation was leagues away from our understanding. For example, animal butchery often happened in the open streets, with blood and offal simply washed into the gutters, contributing to the general aroma of the town. Compared to that, perhaps the jail isn't that much worse. No, wait. It definitely is. Historians still debate the extent to which society viewed imprisonment itself as a punishment versus simply a means of detention. While later periods saw the rise of the penitentiary and the idea of imprisonment as a reformative or punitive sentence, in much of the Middle Ages, the horrors of the jail were more of an unfortunate byproduct of waiting for your actual punishment, which was likely to be far more direct and physical. For you, this distinction is academic. It feels like a punishment, a very effective one. You'd confess to plotting to overthrow the king if it meant getting out of this hole. Maybe even confess to liking the new court jester's terrible puns. Okay, maybe not that far. Some things are beyond the pale. Time loses all meaning in the darkness. Is it still night? Has the sun risen? There's no way to tell. Just the occasional shuffle from your fellow inmates, the drip of water somewhere in the darkness, the distant, muffled sounds of the town waking up, a cock crowing, the rumble of a cart, sounds of a world you're no longer a part of. The hunger gnaws at you, sharper now, more insistent. You wonder if they'll bring any food. Probably not. Your little escapade didn't exactly scream, wealthy patron who can afford the jailer's deluxe bread and water package. You close your eyes, trying to block out the smell, the sounds, the crushing weight of your predicament. Sleep is impossible. Your mind races, replaying your stupid, clumsy attempt at theft, the merchant's outraged face, the terrifying pursuit. If only you'd stayed in that doorway. If only you'd found a slightly more rotten apple in a gutter. But if onlys are cold comfort in a medieval jail. All you have is the cold, the dark, the damp, and the growing certainty that this is just the beginning of your troubles. An eternity later, or perhaps just a few miserable, stench-filled hours, it's hard to say when time is measured in drips from a leaky ceiling and the rustling of unseen vermin. The heavy door to your subterranean boudoir groans open. A sliver of gray, morning light, far brighter than the gloom you've become accustomed to, slices into the cell, making you squint. A figure stands silhouetted in the doorway, the jailer presumably, or one of his charming assistants. He's a burly man, with a face like a forgotten root vegetable, and he doesn't look like he's here to offer you a continental breakfast. "You, bread snatcher! On your feet!" he barks, his voice as rough as a badger's backside. Apparently your reputation, or at least your nickname, precedes you. You're hauled out of the cell, back into a slightly less dark corridor, though the air quality hasn't noticeably improved. The transition from near total darkness to even dim light is momentarily blinding. You blink, trying to get your bearings. Another figure is waiting. This one looks more official, perhaps a clerk or a minor functionary of the local court, judging by the slightly cleaner, albeit still drab, tunic and the ink stains on his fingers. He's carrying a wooden board with some parchment attached. He peers at you with an air of profound boredom, as if processing petty thieves is the highlight of his thrilling career. "Name?" he drones without much interest. You tell him. He scrawls something on the parchment with a sputtering quill. Accused of attempting to steal one loaf of bread, property of Gildas the baker, and causing a disturbance of the king's peace. How do you answer? How do you answer? Guilty with an explanation? Not guilty by reason of extreme peckishness? The options don't seem great. Medieval legal processes were a far cry from the elaborate systems of justice we recognize today, with their presumption of innocence, right to legal counsel, and complex rules of evidence. For a commoner accused of a petty crime, due process often meant a swift, bewildering, and frequently arbitrary experience. There was no public defender's office you could call. If you were wealthy or well-connected, you might be able to hire someone learned in the law to argue your case. But for someone like you were pretty much on your own, facing a system that was often heavily weighted in favor of the accuser and the established order. Your trial, if you could even call it that, might be over before you even understood what was happening. You try to explain about the hunger, the rain, the desperation. The clerk just looks at you with a blank expression, as if you're speaking a foreign language. Maybe you are. The language of common sense doesn't seem to be on his curriculum. You might be brought before a local manorial court, presided over by the lord of the manor or his steward, or perhaps a town court, if you're in a borough with its own judicial rights. These courts dealt with a wide range of local offenses, from petty theft and assault to disputes over land and debts. The proceedings could be informal and rapid. Witnesses would be heard. In your case, Gildas the baker would no doubt give a dramatic and likely exaggerated account of your villainy. You'd be allowed to speak, but your word as an accused vagrant would carry little weight against that of an established shopkeeper. Judgment could be swift and summary. Sometimes, especially in more serious cases or when evidence was lacking, the medieval legal system resorted to some rather unconventional methods of determining guilt or innocence. One of these was the trial by ordeal. An authoritative historical fact, trial by ordeal was a judicial practice in which the guilt or innocence of the accused was determined by subjecting them to a painful, often dangerous experience. The outcome was believed to be a divine judgment. If you survived, or if your wounds healed in a particular way, God had supposedly declared you innocent. If not, well, tough luck, and probably also a sign from God that you were a wrong-un. The Church officially condemned trial by ordeal in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council, but the practice lingered on in some secular courts for a while longer, especially in more remote areas or for certain types of offenses. You desperately hope your case isn't deemed worthy of such divine intervention. It sounds like a lose-lose situation. Heads, you're guilty. Tails, God smites you. Not great odds. There were various forms of ordeal. Trial by hot iron involved carrying a red-hot piece of iron for a set distance. Your hand would then be bandaged, and if it healed cleanly within a few days, you were innocent. If it festered, which, given medieval hygiene, it almost certainly would, you were guilty. Trial by hot water involved plunging your arm into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone. Same principle with the healing. Trial by cold water was particularly interesting. You'd be bound and thrown into a body of blessed water. If you floated, the water, being pure, was deemed to be rejecting you, meaning you were guilty. If you sank, you were innocent. Of course, you also might drown before they could pull you out. But hey, at least your name was cleared. Small mercies. You make a mental note to practice your sinking skills, just in case. Historians still debate the true purpose and perceived fairness of trials by ordeal. Were they genuinely believed to be divinely ordained, or were they a form of psychological coercion, a way to scare a confession out of the guilty, or perhaps even a socially accepted way of resolving disputes when clear evidence was absent? Some argue that the priests administering these rituals could subtly influence the outcome based on their own assessment of the accused's guilt or local public opinion. Regardless, the thought of facing such a test is terrifying. You'd much prefer a jury of your peers, assuming your peers weren't all angry bakers and people who enjoy a good public pursuit. The clerk is still looking at you. "The magistrate will see you shortly," he says, with all the enthusiasm of someone announcing a particularly dull turnip harvest. "Don't try anything stupid." As if you could. You're weak from hunger and your recent manhandling, and the jailer looks like he could wrestle a bear and win. You just nod numbly. An odd, off-topic fact that drifts into your bewildered mind. In some parts of medieval Europe, there were courts of love, aristocratic gatherings where knights and ladies would debate intricate points of romantic etiquette and pass judgment on fictional love dilemmas. It sounds rather more pleasant than your current judicial predicament. You doubt anyone here is going to debate whether your love for bread was tragically unrequited or simply misguided. Probably the latter. You're left in the corridor for a while, guarded by the silent, brooding jailer. The fear of the unknown is almost as bad as the physical discomfort. What will this magistrate be like? Will he be a stern but fair man of justice, or a petty tyrant eager to make an example of you? Will you even get a chance to plead your case properly? The arbitrary nature of it all is terrifying. Your fate hangs in the balance, dependent on the whims of individuals, and a system that feels designed to crush rather than to comprehend. The word justice echoes mockingly in your mind. Right now it feels more like a lottery, and you're pretty sure you've drawn the losing ticket. Your brief, inglorious brush with the law is about to enter its next, and likely even less pleasant phase. After what feels like another geological epoch spent contemplating the intricate patterns of damp on the corridor wall and the jailer's remarkable ability to remain perfectly still and menacing, you're finally summoned. "All right, bread thief, your turn to face the music," the jailer grunts, giving you a none too gentle shove towards another doorway. This room is slightly larger than your previous accommodations and marginally better lit, though that's not saying much. It's furnished with a sturdy wooden table and a couple of equally sturdy chairs. Seated at the table is a man who can only be the magistrate. He's older, with a severe face, thinning gray hair, and small, shrewd eyes that seem to see right through your ragged tunic and into your very soul, or at least right to the part of your soul that was seriously contemplating liberating that loaf of bread. The clerk from earlier is there too, standing beside the magistrate, parchments at the ready. Gildas the baker is also present, looking self-important and righteous, occasionally glaring at you as if you'd personally insulted his entire baking lineage. You're positioned in front of the table, feeling small, dirty, and overwhelmingly guilty, even though the actual crime was more of an enthusiastic misjudgment than a successful heist. It feels less like a court and more like being called to the headmaster's office after being caught with a frog in your pocket, only the consequences here are likely to be considerably more severe than a stern lecture and a letter home to your mum. The magistrate clears his throat, a dry, rustling sound. "So," he begins, his voice surprisingly soft, but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "This is the scoundrel who disturbs the peace of our town and attempts to rob honest tradesmen in the dead of night?" Gildas puffs up, ready to launch into his heroic tale, but the magistrate silences him with a curt wave of his hand. He turns his gaze to you. "You've heard the accusation. What have you to say for yourself? And make it brief. I haven't got all day for the laments of every footpad and pilferer who darkens my door." You try to speak, to articulate the gnawing hunger, the desperation that drove you. Your voice comes out as a raspy whisper at first. You explain as best you can your circumstances. You emphasize that you didn't actually take anything. You were just looking, with intent, very hungry intent. The magistrate listens, his expression unreadable. Gildas scoffs audibly. The clerk diligently scribbles notes, probably transcribing your pathetic excuses into something damning like, "Accused admits to coveting baked goods with felonious desire." Unfortunately for you, "I was really hungry" wasn't generally considered a valid legal defense in the Middle Ages. While the church preached charity and theologians debated the morality of stealing in dire need, the concept of necessity, sometimes allowing for it in extreme circumstances, though this was highly nuanced, the secular law was often far more concerned with protecting property rights. And property, especially for a tradesman like Gildas, was sacrosanct. Letting you off lightly might encourage every other starving person in town to try their luck, and that, from the perspective of the authorities, would be anarchy. One authoritative historical fact: forest law in medieval England was notoriously harsh. Peasants were forbidden from hunting in the king's forests, even if they were starving. Poaching, even of a rabbit, could result in severe penalties, including mutilation or death, because the game was considered the king's property. It underscores how seriously property rights, especially those of the powerful, were taken. The magistrate taps his fingers on the table. "Hunger is a harsh master," he says, almost thoughtfully, and for a fleeting second you feel a flicker of hope. Maybe he understands. Maybe he'll show some leniency. Then he continues, "But it does not grant license to steal from those who earn their bread by honest labor. Were I to excuse every hungry man who helped himself to another's goods, the markets would be empty and the town overrun by thieves. There must be order. There must be a lesson." Oh dear. A lesson sounds ominous. It rarely involves cake and a friendly chat, and the lesson, in your case, is unlikely to be a stint of community service or a carefully worded apology note. For petty crimes, especially for first-time offenders who weren't deemed hardened criminals, public humiliation was a common form of punishment. The stocks and the pillory were popular choices. These devices were designed not just to physically discomfort the offender, but to expose them to the scorn and ridicule of their community. It was punishment as public theater, a deterrent for all to see. The pillory was a wooden framework with holes for the head and hands, while the stocks confined the ankles, sometimes also the wrists. Offenders would be locked in for a set period, often in a public place like the market square. Imagine it, you secured in the stocks, unable to move, unable to defend yourself. People would gather to stare, to jeer, to throw things. Not pleasant things, mind you, rotten fruit, mud, animal dung, offal. Whatever unpleasant refuse was at hand, it was an opportunity for the community to vent its disapproval and reinforce social norms. It was also, let's be frank, a form of entertainment. Public punishment broke the monotony of daily life. Some people probably brought snacks. Historians still debate the true deterrent effect of such shaming punishments versus their potential to simply embitter offenders or, ironically, provide a rather grim form of popular entertainment. Did seeing someone in the stocks really make you think twice about stealing that apple? Or did you just feel a bit superior that it wasn't you up there, covered in decomposing vegetables? An odd, off-topic fact for you. Sometimes the crime itself was written on a placard and hung around the offender's neck, or the offending item, if small enough, was displayed with them. So you might be sitting in the stocks with a sign saying, "I stole a turnip," or with the actual pilfered turnip slowly rotting beside your head. It was very specific shaming. In your case, perhaps they'd fashion a little necklace out of stale breadcrumbs. Delightful. The magistrate is looking at your shabby clothes, your gaunt face. He probably sees 1,000 others like you who have passed through his court. Vagrants, drifters, the desperate poor. He sighs. Given your evident lack of means to pay a fine and the minor nature of the actual theft, or attempted theft, I am not inclined towards the more severe penalties this time. A tiny spark of relief ignites, then is immediately doused by his next words. However, an example must be made. 3 hours in the pillory in the market square, starting at noon, and then you will be escorted from this town and told not to return, on pain of a more robust welcome should we see your face again. The pillory, 3 hours in the market square, at noon when the square would be busiest. Fantastic. It's not the gallows, it's not mutilation, so you suppose you should be grateful. But the thought of standing there, exposed, helpless, the object of public scorn and rotten vegetable missiles, fills you with a cold, clammy dread. And then banishment, cast out with nowhere to go, marked as a troublemaker. The lesson, it seems, is going to be a particularly unpleasant one. Your grand adventure into the world of medieval crime has led you here, to a sentence of public humiliation and exile. Not exactly the heroic ballad you might have imagined in your more desperate moments, more like a rather sad, smelly limerick. The magistrate's words, 3 hours in the pillory, hang in the air like the smell of stale ale and regret. It's a reprieve from the worst imaginable fates, true, but the prospect is still utterly horrifying. You're not losing a hand, you're not facing the hangman's noose, but the shame, the helplessness, the public degradation. It feels like a different kind of amputation, a carving away of your dignity. The jailer, who seems to derive a certain grim satisfaction from these proceedings, hauls you back to your cell, or perhaps a slightly less appalling one, though the difference is academic to your numb senses. You're given a hunk of coarse, dry bread, irony of ironies, and a mug of lukewarm, slightly scummy water. It's not exactly a celebratory meal for escaping a harsher sentence, but it's the first thing you've eaten in what feels like days, and you wolf it down despite its resemblance to compressed sawdust. Waiting for noon is its own form of torture. Time crawls. Each cough from a nearby cell, each distant shout from the town, seems to magnify your anxiety. You try to imagine what it will be like. The market square, the crowds, the jeers, the smell of whatever rotten refuse they decide to lob in your direction. It's a uniquely medieval form of agony, this focus on public shame. While imprisonment itself was often dire, as you've experienced, many of the formal punishments were designed to be highly visible, to serve as a stark warning to the populace. It wasn't enough to punish the offender. The community needed to see the punishment. When the time finally comes, you're let out, not by the taciturn jailer this time, but by a couple of burly town guards who seem to view the task with a mixture of boredom and mild amusement. It's probably a regular part of their duties, parading petty criminals to their public penance. The market square is, as predicted, bustling. It's the heart of the town, a vibrant, noisy hub of activity. Vendors are hawking their wares, pies of questionable origin, pottery, rough-spun cloth, clucking chickens in cages. Townspeople are haggling, gossiping, going about their daily business. And then they see you. A ripple of interest goes through the crowd. "There's the thief!" someone calls out, and heads turn. Conversations pause. You, with your head bowed, your hands bound loosely in front of you, become the unwilling center of attention. The guards lead you to the pillory, a sturdy wooden structure standing prominently in the middle of the square. It looks old, well used, stained with who knows what. It has 3 holes, a larger one for the neck and 2 smaller ones for the wrists. It's set at an awkward height, designed to make you stoop uncomfortably. This isn't just about restraint, it's about discomfort and humiliation. The guards are efficient, unceremonious. They open the hinged wooden beam, position your head and hands in the holes, and then slam it shut, securing it with a heavy wooden peg. You're trapped. Your neck is craned forward, your arms stretched out, your body bent. It's immediately uncomfortable, and you know that after 3 hours, it will be agony. You can't move your head much, can't protect your face. You are completely exposed, utterly vulnerable. A spectacle. The crowd draws closer, forming a loose circle. Children, predictably, are at the front, giggling and pointing. Some of the adults wear expressions of stern disapproval. Others, you notice with a sinking heart, have smirks on their faces. They're here for the show. And the show, it seems, is about to begin. The first missile isn't long in coming. A rotten turnip, thrown by a young apprentice with a good arm, splatters against the wood just beside your head, spattering you with mushy, rank-smelling vegetable matter. A cheer goes up from some of the onlookers. This is going to be a long 3 hours. While public humiliation was common, for more serious crimes or for repeat offenders, the punishments escalated significantly. Judicial mutilation, and the deliberate maiming of an offender as a legal penalty, was a terrifying reality in the medieval world. An authoritative historical fact, the Assize of Clarendon in 1166 under Henry II of England, prescribed punishments like the cutting off of a hand or a foot for various felonies, especially for those who failed a trial by ordeal or were of notoriously bad repute. This wasn't arbitrary cruelty, though it certainly was cruel. It was a codified part of the legal system. The idea was twofold: to punish the criminal in a way that was visible and permanent, and to physically impair their ability to commit further crimes. A one-handed thief would find it much harder to pick pockets or scale walls. Losing a hand was a common punishment for theft. Imagine that. Your hand, the one you used to work, to eat, to defend yourself, gone. Brutally and often unhygienically amputated, likely with an axe or a cleaver, probably by the local executioner or even a blacksmith pressed into service. The chances of infection in such a procedure were astronomical. Many who suffered such mutilations likely died from sepsis or blood loss. If you survived, you were marked for life, a walking testament to your crime, shunned and often unable to find honest work. Other forms of mutilation included blinding, castration, for sexual offenses, or cutting off ears or the nose, often for perjury or slander. It's a grim catalogue of horrors, a far cry from a fine or a few hours in the pillory. You suddenly feel a profound, albeit still miserable, sense of relief that your crime was only attempted bread napping. Perhaps the magistrate really was being lenient. Historians still debate the true deterrent effect of such brutal punishments. Did the sight of a maimed criminal truly scare others straight, or did it simply brutalize society further? Some argue that in an era without widespread, effective policing, these stark, physical punishments were seen as necessary to maintain order and control. Others suggest they reflected a different understanding of the body and justice, where the physical form was seen as something that could be legally inscribed with the mark of wrongdoing. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That your body could literally become a billboard for your transgressions. Visit sunny Acorn Wood. See the thief with no hands. Not exactly a tourist slogan that trips off the tongue. An odd, or perhaps just gruesome off-topic fact. Executioners sometimes sold the body parts of executed criminals, as these were believed by some to have magical or medicinal properties. A hand of glory, the dried, pickled hand of a hanged man, preferably holding a candle made from his own fat, was thought to be a powerful talisman for thieves, capable of inducing sleep in an entire household or rendering its occupants motionless. The irony of thieves using a part of a punished criminal to aid in their own crimes is, well, it's peak medieval thinking, really. You hope no one is eyeing up your hands for future artisanal craft projects. More refuse is flying now. Mud, vegetable peelings, something that looks suspiciously like the contents of a chamber pot. Each impact is a fresh humiliation. You try to close your eyes to retreat into some inner space, but the jeers, the laughter, the stench are inescapable. Your neck and shoulders are already aching fiercely. The sun, weak as it is, seems to beat down on your exposed head. You reflect that, Even in your current degraded state, at least you aren't literally losing a part of yourself. This is temporary. Mutilation is forever. That thought, grim as it is, provides a sliver of perspective. Your dignity is taking a beating, but your limbs for now remain attached. Small mercies in a world where mercy often seemed to be in very short supply. The hours stretch before you, a gauntlet of shame and discomfort, but you will endure it. Because the alternative, the fate of those deemed worthy of losing parts, is a horror you can barely comprehend. The 3 hours in the pillory crawl by with agonizing slowness. Each minute feels like an hour, each jeer a fresh barb. Your body aches, your clothes are caked with filth, and your spirit feels as bruised and battered as the rotten fruit splattered around you. Eventually, mercifully, the town guards return. With a rough indifference, they release you from the pillory. You nearly collapse as your stiff, abused limbs try to remember how to support you. You stink. You're humiliated, but you're whole. The guards, true to the magistrate's word, escort you to the edge of town with a stern warning never to show your face there again. You don't need telling twice. You stumble away, putting as much distance as possible between yourself and that particular monument to public shaming. As you walk, or rather hobble, along the muddy track leading away from the town, your thoughts inevitably turn to even grimmer possibilities. You got off relatively lightly, all things considered. A few hours of public ridicule, banishment. But what if your crime had been deemed more serious? What if you were a repeat offender? Or what if you'd been accused of something truly heinous in the eyes of medieval law, like murder, treason, or persistent, unrepentant heresy? Then the pillory would have seemed like a pleasant day out. Then you might have been heading for Gallows Hill. Public execution was the ultimate expression of medieval justice, a gruesome spectacle designed to be as terrifying and deterrent as possible. The gallows, often situated on a prominent hill just outside the town walls, hence Gallows Hill, was a permanent fixture, a constant reminder of the king's law and the consequences of defying it. It wasn't tucked away discreetly. It was meant to be seen. Executions were public events, often drawing large crowds. People would travel from surrounding villages to witness the spectacle. It was, in a dark and twisted way, another form of public entertainment, like a more extreme version of the pillory. Vendors might sell food and drink. Families would bring their children. It sounds horrifying to us, but it was a deeply ingrained part of medieval and early modern life. A day at the executions, cheaper than the joust, and the souvenirs were, well, probably best not to think about the souvenirs. Hanging was the most common method of execution for common criminals. It was a slow, agonizing death by strangulation. The drop, designed to snap the neck and cause instant death, was a later refinement. In the medieval period, the condemned was often simply turned off a ladder or pulled up by a rope slung over the gallows beam, left to thrash and choke until they expired. It could take many minutes. It was a brutal, ugly way to die, and the crowd would watch, sometimes silent, sometimes jeering, sometimes even pelting the unfortunate soul with stones or refuse. An authoritative historical fact. The Tyburn Tree in London, a famous public gallows from the 12th century until the late 18th century, was a massive triangular structure capable of hanging multiple condemned prisoners simultaneously, up to 24, according to some accounts. Execution days at Tyburn were major public holidays, with tens of thousands of spectators. processions of the condemned from Newgate Prison to Tyburn were themselves public spectacles. It was justice as a grand, gruesome performance. You try to imagine such a scene, the noise, the anticipation, the sheer visceral horror of it, and a shiver runs down your spine, despite the mild afternoon sun. For crimes deemed particularly heinous, such as treason, even more elaborate and brutal methods of execution were employed. Hanged, drawn, and quartered was the prescribed punishment for high treason in England. This involved being hanged until almost dead, then disemboweled while still alive, your entrails burned before your eyes, and finally your body beheaded and cut into 4 quarters, which would then be displayed in prominent public places as a warning. It's almost impossible for us to comprehend the level of institutionalized brutality involved in such a punishment. It was designed to utterly annihilate the individual, both physically and symbolically. Even thinking about it makes your stomach churn. Your little attempt at bread theft seems almost comically insignificant in comparison. Maybe that magistrate really was a saint in disguise, a beacon of merciful jurisprudence. Or maybe he just had a soft spot for really incompetent criminals. Historians still debate the psychological impact of these public executions on the populace. Did they truly deter crime through fear? Or did they, as some argue, desensitize people to violence and brutality, perhaps even incite further lawlessness by providing a model of state-sanctioned violence? Were the crowds there purely for the grim spectacle, or was there also a sense of communal participation in the meting out of justice, a reaffirmation of social order? The answer is likely complex and varied. For some, it might have been a solemn warning. For others, a gruesome day out. For the person on the gallows, it was quite simply the terrifying end. Oddly, or perhaps appropriately, your mind wanders to a less grim but equally public spectacle, a medieval mystery play. You once saw one performed on a cart in a village square, depicting biblical scenes with earnest, if sometimes clumsy, actors. The devils always had the best costumes and the most enthusiastic lines. There's a strange parallel, isn't there, between the didactic morality of the mystery play and the didactic horror of the public execution. Both were forms of public instruction, albeit with vastly different methods and messages. Be good, or the devil will get you. Steal, and the hangman will get you. Both playing to a captive audience, as you trudge onward, leaving the town and its justice further behind. The image of Gallows Hill looms large in your imagination. You picture the stark silhouette of the gallows against a gray sky, the dangling ropes, the crows circling overhead. It's a powerful symbol of the ultimate consequence. You might be an outcast now, hungry and with an uncertain future, but you're walking away. You're alive. You're not facing that final, terrible dance at the end of a rope. The thought is sobering and, in a strange way, almost liberating. Your troubles are far from over, but you've avoided the very worst that medieval justice could offer. And for that, in the quiet solitude of the open road, you are profoundly, if miserably, grateful. The path ahead is unknown, but at least it's a path you still get to walk. For now. You've been walking for hours, putting as much distance as possible between yourself and the town with its judgmental eyes and its overabundance of rotten turnips. Your feet ache. Your stomach is a hollow cavern once more, and the banishment order means you can't just turn back. The road stretches ahead, dusty and indifferent. The initial relief of escaping the pillory and the shadow of Gallows Hill is slowly being replaced by a more practical and equally pressing anxiety. Where do you go now? What do you do? You're an outcast, a marked person. The world, which already felt harsh and unforgiving, now seems even more so. As dusk begins to settle, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, you spot a building in the distance, nestled amongst a small grove of trees. It's larger than the peasant hovels you've occasionally passed, and there's a sense of solidity, of permanence about it. As you draw closer, you recognize the unmistakable shape of a church. Not a grand cathedral, but a smaller, simpler parish church. And with the sight of the church comes a flicker of a different kind of thought, a desperate last resort idea: sanctuary. The concept of sanctuary is an ancient one, found in many cultures and religions, but in medieval Europe, it was a particularly well-established, if often contentious, legal principle. Essentially, certain holy places, primarily churches and their consecrated grounds, offered a degree of protection to fugitives from secular law. If you could reach the sanctuary and formally claim its protection, you were, in theory, safe from arrest by secular authorities for a limited period, typically 40 days. During this time, you were supposed to be safe from violence and could negotiate your fate. This wasn't a get-out-of-jail-free card, but it was a potential lifeline for someone in deep trouble. A way to hit pause on the relentless machinery of justice. You think, maybe, just maybe, this is an option. If only to rest for a night without fear of being immediately grabbed by the local watch of this new, unfamiliar territory. To claim sanctuary, you generally had to reach the church itself, often by grasping a specific object like the church door knocker, some of which were quite elaborate, almost like a formal "apply here for asylum" button, or the altar. Once inside, you would confess your crime to the clergy and formally seek the church's protection. The church authorities would then, in theory, shield you from the secular arm of the law. This didn't mean you were free to go. The choices were usually stark. Within the 40 days, you had to either reconcile with your accusers, perhaps by paying a hefty compensation if your crime allowed for it and you somehow had the means, or you had to agree to abjure the realm. Abjuration meant confessing your felony publicly, often in the churchyard, and then swearing an oath to leave the kingdom permanently by a specific port, often barefoot and carrying a wooden cross, never to return on pain of death. You'd basically become an exile, a stateless person. An authoritative historical fact: the frith stool or peace chair is a type of ancient stone seat found in some English churches, notably Hexham Abbey and Beverley Minster. Sitting in such a chair was believed to grant an exceptionally strong form of sanctuary. These were serious bits of furniture, not just any old pew. Touching them meant you were invoking a very powerful and ancient form of protection, and woe betide anyone who tried to drag you off it. It makes you wonder if they were particularly uncomfortable to discourage people from claiming sanctuary for too long. My immortal soul is safe, but my backside is killing me. So, as you approach this quiet country church, the idea of sanctuary is a potent lure, a roof over your head, a brief respite from hunger and fear, but it's not without its risks. The right of sanctuary was often a point of friction between the church and secular rulers. Kings and nobles sometimes resented the church's power to shield criminals, especially those accused of serious offenses or those they particularly wanted to get their hands on. There were instances where secular authorities violated sanctuary, forcibly dragging fugitives from churches, which was considered a grave sacrilege and could lead to excommunication for those involved. But it happened. So, even if you made it inside, there was no absolute guarantee of safety. The local lord might be less than pleased to have a self-confessed thief taking refuge in his parish church. Historians still debate the true effectiveness and social function of sanctuary. Was it a genuine, compassionate measure, a safety valve in a harsh legal system, offering a chance for mercy or negotiation? Or was it more of a power play by the church, asserting its authority over secular law? Or perhaps it primarily benefited the church by allowing it to confiscate the property of those who abjured the realm. The reality was probably a mix of all these things. For you, the debate is less about ecclesiastical power structures and more about whether you can get through the night without being arrested again or eaten by wolves. The wolves are probably a metaphor, mostly. You hesitate at the edge of the churchyard. The place looks peaceful enough. The last rays of sun glint off a small, stained glass window. There's a quiet graveyard beside the church, the leaning stones weathered and ancient. An odd, off-topic thought strikes you. You read once, or perhaps heard a minstrel sing a song about it, that some medieval monks were renowned for their skill in brewing ale. Perhaps this church has a particularly charitable brewmaster on staff. Probably wishful thinking. They're more likely to offer you holy water and a stern lecture on the sinfulness of wanting bread. And given your recent experience with being lectured by authority figures, you're not entirely keen on another round. The precariousness of sanctuary is its defining feature. It was a haven, yes, but a fragile one, dependent on a complex interplay of law, custom, and power. If the crime was too severe, or if the fugitive was too politically important, the protection could crumble. Moreover, life within sanctuary wasn't exactly luxurious. You were confined, reliant on charity, often from the local parish, which might resent the burden, and the 40-day clock was always ticking. It was a state of limbo, a period of intense uncertainty. But still, compared to another night sleeping in a ditch with an empty stomach and the fear of arrest, it has a certain appeal. You clutch the rough wooden cross you tore from a roadside shrine earlier, an act of minor vandalism you hope God will forgive, given the circumstances. Maybe holding it will give you some extra points if you do decide to knock on that heavy oak door. The decision weighs heavily. To risk sanctuary, or to keep moving, hoping to find some other, less complicated refuge in the darkening wilderness. The church stands silent, offering either salvation or another kind of trap. Ultimately, the thought of another night exposed to the elements, coupled with the gnawing fear of being discovered by some new, equally enthusiastic set of law enforcers, tips the balance. Sanctuary, for all its precariousness, seems like the less terrible option right now. You shuffle towards the church door, your heart thumping a nervous rhythm against your ribs. But as you get closer, you see it, a notice, roughly scrawled and nailed to the ancient wood. It's hard to make out in the fading light, but you can decipher a few key words. No sanctuary, by order of Lord Fulk, and something about vagrants and thieves not welcome. So much for that plan. It seems Lord Fulk is not a fan of the church's little legal loophole, at least not in his domain. The church, your supposed haven, is closed to you. Perhaps Lord Fulk had a bad experience with a sanctuary seeker absconding with the communion wine, or maybe he just liked his justice swift and uncomplicated. The disappointment is a lead weight in your already empty stomach. The brief flicker of hope is extinguished, leaving you with the familiar companions of despair and desperation. You turn away from the uncharitable church and melt back into the shadows of the trees as full darkness descends. There's no refuge to be had here. You're on your own again, and now, with the knowledge that even the traditional escape route of sanctuary might be barred to you, the future looks even bleaker. You are, in essence, an outlaw. Life as an outlaw in the Middle Ages was not the romantic adventure often portrayed in ballads and stories of Robin Hood and his merry men. While those tales offered a fantasy of freedom, camaraderie, and righteous rebellion, the reality for most outlaws was grim, solitary, and short. To be declared an outlaw, caput lupinum, or wolf's head, as it was known in English common law, meant you were stripped of all legal protection. You existed outside the law. Anyone could, in theory, kill you on sight without penalty, just as they might kill a wolf. Your property, if you had any, was forfeit to the crown or the local lord. You had no rights, no recourse, no safe place to turn. You were, quite literally, fair game. Now, you haven't officially been declared a wolf's head through a formal legal process yet, but being banished from one town and finding sanctuary denied in another puts you in a functionally similar position. You are beyond the pale of normal society. Surviving as an outlaw meant living constantly on the run, avoiding populated areas where you might be recognized or betrayed. The wilderness, forests, moorlands, swamps became your unwilling home. You'd have to learn to forage for food, to hunt or trap small game, illegally, of course, adding another crime to your growing list, and to find shelter from the elements. A crude lean-to, a cave, a hollow tree, these were your new manners. Forget warm beds and regular meals. Think damp earth, cold nights, and the constant gnawing hunger that started this whole mess in the first place, now amplified by exertion and uncertainty. You might fall in with other outcasts, forming small, desperate bands for mutual protection, but such groups were often plagued by mistrust and internal strife. There's not much honor among freezing, starving thieves. One bad apple in a band of bad apples can make for a very rotten situation. An authoritative historical fact, the legal status of an outlaw, the wolf's head, meant they could indeed be killed with impunity. The person who killed them might even be rewarded. It was a brutal but effective way for authorities to deal with those who defied their justice, effectively putting a bounty on their heads and outsourcing the enforcement to the general populace. This created a powerful incentive for people to turn in or eliminate outlaws, making trust a very rare and precious commodity for anyone on the wrong side of the law. You'd have to sleep with one eye open, constantly suspicious of everyone you encountered. Did that friendly peasant offering you a piece of bread genuinely pity you, or was he planning to cave your head in with a rock as soon as you closed your eyes, all for a few pennies from the local reeve? Good times. The dangers were manifold. Aside from the ever-present threat of capture or betrayal, there was the weather, wild animals, actual wolves this time, not just metaphorical ones. Sickness and injury, a twisted ankle, a festering wound, things that might be minor inconveniences in a more settled life, could be a death sentence for an outlaw, unable to rest or seek proper care. Remember that glorious medieval medical knowledge we touched on with the crocodile poop sunscreen. Yeah, you're not getting much of that out in the woods. Your best bet for a wound is probably some moss and a prayer, and the moss might be cleaner. Historians still debate the actual numbers and societal impact of outlaws. Were they a widespread menace, or a relatively small group of desperate individuals on the fringes of society? Court records and literary sources suggest they were a persistent concern for authorities, but their lives were so clandestine that a true picture is hard to form. Tales of famous outlaws like Hereward the Wake or the aforementioned Robin Hood, whose historical reality is itself a subject of much debate, might exaggerate their numbers and influence, but they reflect a real societal phenomenon, people living outside the established legal and social structures. You are now one of them, albeit a singularly unimpressive and unwilling one. You don't feel like you're about to start robbing from the rich to give to the poor. You'd rob from the rich to give to yourself, mostly because the poor, i.e., you, are exceptionally hungry. The forest you're currently skulking through is dark and unwelcoming. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl sounds like a threat. You find a relatively dry patch of ground beneath a large, ancient oak, its gnarled branches offering a modicum of shelter from the night wind. It's not comfortable, but it's marginally better than nothing. As you huddle there shivering, an odd, off-topic thought flits through your mind. You once heard that acorns, if properly leached of their tannins, could be ground into a sort of flour. You look up at the oak. It's covered in them. Maybe tomorrow you'll start your new career as a forager. Or maybe you'll just lie here and feel sorry for yourself. Probably a bit of both. The life of an outlaw isn't just about daring escapes and splitting arrows with a bow. It's about cold, hunger, fear, and a profound, crushing loneliness. It's the ultimate social distancing, medieval style. And you've got a front row seat to this exclusive, highly undesirable lifestyle. The night in the forest is long, cold, and punctuated by the unsettling noises of unseen creatures. Sleep is fitful, a series of brief, nightmare-tinged dozes from which you awaken with a start, convinced you're about to be pounced upon by either Lord Fulk's men or a particularly disgruntled badger. The failed sanctuary attempt and the dawning reality of your outlaw status have left a bitter taste in your mouth, far worse than the lingering flavor of rotten turnip. As the first gray light of dawn filters through the dense canopy, you are acutely aware of your isolation, not just from towns and villages, but from any semblance of security or hope. And in this desolate state, your mind, as it so often does for people in medieval times, and arguably even now, turns to less tangible but no less potent forces, superstition, omens, and the desperate hope for divine intervention, or at least a cessation of divine displeasure. Medieval society was steeped in a belief system where the natural and supernatural worlds were deeply intertwined. God, angels, saints, demons, and a host of lesser spirits were seen as active participants in daily life. Every event, from a bountiful harvest to a sudden illness, from a lucky find to a disastrous fire, could be interpreted as a sign, a message from the spiritual realm. For someone like you, a fugitive on the fringes, constantly peering over your shoulder, this worldview would be amplified. You'd be hyper-aware of potential omens, desperately seeking some indication of what the future might hold or what cosmic forces you might have offended to land yourself in such a dire predicament. It's not like you could check your horoscope on an app. You had to read the signs in the world around you, and mostly the signs probably looked a bit grim. Path ahead blocked by large, angry-looking boar. Probably a metaphor, or just a boar. Either way, bad. You remember the old woman in your village who was said to be able to read fortunes in the way birds flew, or in the patterns of sheep entrails, a charming practice known as haruspicy, though perhaps less common at the village level than among, say, Roman augurs. You scan the sky, a lone crow circles overhead, then flies off towards the west. Is that good? Bad? Does west mean wealth or woe? You have no idea. These interpretations were often highly localized and subjective. One person's good omen could be another's harbinger of doom. It's all very confusing when you're trying to navigate your life by the flight patterns of carrion birds. Maybe it just means there's a dead rabbit over there, which, frankly, would be a good omen for your stomach. Then there are the dreams. Medieval people placed great store in the significance of dreams, believing they could be messages from God, temptations from the devil, or portents of things to come. Your dreams, when you manage to have them between shivering fits, are likely a chaotic jumble of pursuit, falling, and endless empty banqueting tables where the food always vanishes just as you reach for it. Probably not a good sign, or perhaps just a sign that you're really, really hungry and quite stressed. The line between psychological distress and supernatural influence was often blurred. Religious anxieties would also loom large. You've sinned. You attempted theft. You've been publicly shamed and banished. Is God punishing you? Is this a test of your faith? Or have you, through your actions, opened yourself up to demonic influence? The fear of hell and eternal damnation was a very real and potent force. You might find yourself making furtive, whispered prayers to any saint who might be listening, especially those known as patrons of lost causes or desperate situations. Saint Jude, perhaps, or Saint Anthony if you've misplaced your last crust of bread. You might cross yourself repeatedly when passing a particularly ancient, gnarled tree that looks like it might harbor a malicious wood sprite. You'd be wary of crossroads at night, as they were often considered places where the veil between worlds was thin and supernatural encounters were more likely, which, given that you're currently sleeping rough in a forest, probably means you're living in a prime location for encountering all sorts of interesting and probably unhelpful entities. An authoritative historical fact: relics of saints were incredibly important in medieval religious life. These could be bones, fragments of clothing, or objects associated with a saint, and they were believed to possess miraculous powers, including healing and protection. Pilgrimages to shrines housing important relics were common. As an outlaw, you wouldn't exactly be embarking on a grand pilgrimage, but you might clutch a pebble from near a holy well or a leaf from a tree growing in a churchyard, hoping it carries some residual sanctity and protective power. Anything to feel a little less alone and a little more shielded from the myriad dangers, both seen and unseen. Historians still debate the extent to which popular folk beliefs and superstitions coexisted with, or were integrated into, official Christian doctrine. While the Church condemned many pagan practices, elements of older belief systems often lingered, adapting and merging with Christian rituals and an understanding of the world. For the average peasant, or indeed a desperate outlaw, the world was a place of powerful, often capricious forces, and you used whatever tools, prayer, charms, observance of omens, you could to try and navigate it safely. It's easy for us, in our more secularized scientific age, to dismiss these beliefs as quaint or irrational, but for someone in your medieval shoes, they were a fundamental part of how you understood and interacted with a dangerous and unpredictable world. They were a coping mechanism, a way of trying to impose some order on the chaos. An odd, off-topic thought. Some medieval remedies for ailments sound utterly bizarre to us now. For toothache, one might recommend carrying a mole's foot in a little bag around your neck. Or for baldness, an ointment made from a mixture of weasel grease and burnt barley straw. Effective? Probably not. But it shows the kind of desperate, empirical, or entirely non-empirical experimentation that went on. You idly wonder if there's a superstitious remedy for being an outcast and starving. Maybe carrying a very lucky turnip? Though your recent experience with turnips suggests they are decidedly not lucky for you. As you sit there, huddled and miserable, watching the forest slowly come alive with the sounds of morning, you are acutely aware of your vulnerability, not just to human laws, but to the perceived whims of fate and the unseen world. Every creak of a branch, every shadow, carries a potential meaning, a potential threat. Your furtive prayers are a mixture of pleading and bargaining. You're not just fighting for physical survival, you're engaged in a constant, anxious negotiation with the very fabric of medieval reality, a reality where bad omens felt as tangible as a guard's fist, and a whispered prayer was sometimes the only shield you had. The day wears on, a slow, grueling passage of time, marked by the shifting patterns of sunlight through the leaves and the persistent, agonizing ache in your belly. You tried chewing on some acorns as per your brilliant idea from the previous night, but even after attempting to mash them with a rock and soak them in a muddy puddle, your best approximation of leaching tannins, they were still incredibly bitter and did little to alleviate the hunger. Mostly they just made your mouth feel like it was full of dusty carpet. So much for living off the bounty of the forest. You're no expert forager. You're a failed bread thief. Your skill set is remarkably narrow and so far entirely unhelpful. As you wander aimlessly, trying to decide which direction offers the least chance of immediate peril, the stark reality of your situation crystallizes. There is no safety net. None. In our modern world, even in difficult circumstances, there are often structures, however flawed or insufficient, designed to catch people when they fall. Social services, charities, unemployment benefits, food banks, homeless shelters. These things, for all their imperfections, represent a societal acknowledgement that people sometimes need help. That misfortune can strike anyone, and that a community has some responsibility towards its most vulnerable members. In your current medieval predicament, such concepts are almost laughably alien. If you get sick out here, truly sick, there's no village doctor you can visit, no medieval equivalent of an urgent care clinic. Herbal remedies known by wise women in villages were the common recourse, but you're far from any village, and wise women probably wouldn't be too keen on helping a known outcast anyway. They had their own reputations to protect. If you injure yourself, a sprained ankle or a deep cut, there's no emergency service to call. You're on your own to bind the wound with whatever dirty rags you possess and hope for the best, a process that, as we've touched upon, often led to infection and a rather unpleasant, solitary demise. Remember the chances of that happening with a judicially amputated hand. Same principle, even for minor injuries in the wild. What about food and shelter when you're not actively on the run from an angry mob or the local lord's men? Monasteries were sometimes known for their charity, offering alms to the poor and a night's lodging to travelers. This was one of the traditional roles of religious houses, to provide hospitality and succor. An authoritative historical fact, the rule of Saint Benedict, which guided many monastic orders, explicitly instructed monks to receive all guests as if they were Christ himself. This principle of hospitality was a cornerstone of monastic life. However, even this avenue might be closed to you. A lone, ragged individual appearing at the monastery gate, stinking of fear and desperation, might be viewed with suspicion. They might offer you a crust of bread and send you on your way, especially if word of your banishment has somehow preceded you, or if Lord Fulk's no vagrants policy extended to influencing the local abbot. And there's always the risk that they might feel obligated to turn you over to the authorities. Charity had its limits, especially when dealing with known troublemakers. Then there are your fellow human beings. While some individuals might show kindness, driven by pity, or their own Christian conscience, many would see you as a threat, a burden, or an opportunity for reward if there was a price on your head, even a metaphorical one. Sharing what little they had with a stranger, especially a suspicious-looking one, was a big ask when their own existence was often precarious. A peasant family struggling to feed their own children would likely be wary of taking in an unknown wanderer. Trust was a rare commodity, and fear was plentiful. Stranger danger wasn't just a modern slogan. It was a deeply ingrained medieval reality. Remember the guy with the rock, contemplating your demise for a few pennies? He's still out there, in spirit if not in person. Historians still debate the levels of communal support versus individual hardship in peasant communities. While village life often involved mutual obligations and cooperation, particularly around agricultural work, the capacity and willingness to support outsiders or those who had fallen foul of the law were likely limited. Society was structured, hierarchical, and often unforgiving to those who didn't fit neatly into their allotted place. You, as a banished, failed thief, are very much outside that structure. You're not contributing to the local economy, unless you count being a bad example. You have no land, no trade, no family ties here. You are, in the bluntest terms, a social liability. An odd, off-topic thought. You recall seeing a puppet show once where one of the puppets kept falling off the stage, only to be yanked back up by its strings by the unseen puppeteer. Right now, you feel like that puppet, but the strings have been cut. There's no one to pull you back up. You're in free fall, and the ground, a hard, unforgiving expanse of starvation and exposure, is rushing up to meet you. It's a sobering contrast to the narratives we often consume, where even in dire straits, there's usually a mentor figure, a lucky break, or an unexpected ally. The medieval reality for someone in your shoes was often a lot less narratively convenient. There was no social security number, no welfare office, no missing persons hotline that would care. The absence of any formal support system makes every small misfortune a potential catastrophe. Losing your flint and tinder could mean freezing to death. Your already threadbare cloak tearing beyond repair could mean a fatal chill. There are no spare cloaks at the Lost and Found. There is no Lost and Found, except for perhaps lost souls like yourself. Your survival depends entirely on your own wits, your own rapidly diminishing strength, and a huge dose of sheer, dumb luck. And luck, as you've already discovered, is a fickle mistress, especially when you've already used up a good portion of it avoiding the gallows and mutilation. This isn't a heroic struggle against a system. It's a desperate, lonely scrabble for continued existence in a world that has, for all intents and purposes, cast you out and forgotten you. The forest is vast, the road is long, and there is no one coming to help. You are utterly, terrifyingly on your own. Days blur into a monotonous cycle of weary trudging, gnawing hunger, and the constant, dull ache of fear. You move from one patch of unwelcoming forest to another, occasionally skirting a sleeping village in the dead of night, hoping to scavenge a discarded apple core or a forgotten turnip from a refuse pile, though your luck with turnips has been consistently, impressively bad. Each sunrise brings not hope, but simply the imperative to keep moving, to keep searching for some morsel of food, some slightly less damp place to rest your aching bones. Your grand career as a medieval thief, which began with such high, or perhaps low hopes of alleviating hunger, has instead plunged you into an even deeper, more sustained state of want. It seems crime, at least your brand of spectacularly incompetent crime, really doesn't pay, except perhaps in lessons about just how miserable life can get. Your existence has become a reflection, albeit a particularly grim one, of the broader hardships that defined life for so many in the medieval period. We often get a rather sanitized, romanticized view of this era. Knights in shining armor, noble ladies in castles, perhaps a jolly monk brewing ale. But for the vast majority of the population, life was a daily struggle against forces largely beyond their control. Famine, disease, war, and the arbitrary power of lords and kings. Your personal, small-scale tragedy of being a failed thief and an outcast is, in many ways, just a concentrated dose of the precariousness that was the baseline for so many. The odds were always stacked against the common person. One bad harvest, one epidemic, one lord deciding to raise taxes or go to war could push an entire community to the brink. Think about it. The constant threat of hunger wasn't unique to outlaws like you. Even settled peasants, working the land day in and day out, lived under the shadow of potential famine. A drought, a flood, a crop blight, any of these could mean starvation for their families. They had little surplus, little cushion against disaster. One authoritative historical fact: life expectancy in the Middle Ages was significantly lower than today, often averaging around 30 to 35 years, though this figure is skewed by very high rates of infant and child mortality. If you survived childhood, you might live into your 50s or 60s, but life was generally shorter and far more brutal than we can easily imagine. You, currently subsisting on questionable berries and the occasional grub, you try not to think too much about what kind of grub, are probably not doing wonders for your own life expectancy statistics. It's less of a balanced diet and more of a whatever doesn't immediately try to bite you back. Diet. Disease was another constant companion. The Black Death in the mid-14th century is the most infamous example, wiping out a huge percentage of Europe's population, but even in normal times, illnesses that we now consider minor could be fatal. Dysentery, influenza, infections from minor wounds, without antibiotics, without an understanding of germ theory, without proper sanitation, these were killers. Your brief, unsanitary stay in the jail, your night in the damp forest, your generally unhygienic lifestyle as a wandering vagabond. You're basically a walking petri dish for medieval pathogens. You've probably picked up more interesting microbes than interesting stories on your travels. Every cough, every strange ache carries with it the terrifying possibility that this is it, the beginning of the end, a slow fade into fever and delirium in some forgotten ditch. And then there was the sheer, back-breaking labor that defined most people's lives. Whether tilling the fields from dawn till dusk or working a craft in a dimly lit workshop, life was physically demanding in a way that's hard for us, with our office jobs and labor-saving devices, to fully comprehend. You, at least, are currently free from an overlord's demands for endless toil, but your freedom is the freedom to starve and shiver. It's not exactly a great trade-off. Perhaps a nice, steady routine of digging ditches doesn't sound so bad when the alternative is trying to decide if that mushroom is earthy and delicious or agonizing last moments delicious. Historians still debate the extent of social mobility in the Middle Ages. While it wasn't entirely static, and individuals could sometimes rise through talent, luck, or service for the most part, you were born into a certain station in life, and that's where you stayed. If you were born a peasant, you died a peasant. If you were born a lord, you generally remained a lord, unless you made some very poor political choices or got on the wrong side of a bigger lord. For someone like you, who has fallen out of even the lowest rungs of the social ladder, the chances of climbing back up are virtually nil. You're not just poor, you're déclassé, an unperson. You make vagrants look like upstanding citizens. An odd, off-topic thought as you rest your weary head against the rough bark of a tree. Even the concept of leisure time was different. For many, there wasn't much of it. Holy days and festivals provided some respite from work, with feasting, if you could afford it, games and religious observances. But the idea of a weekend, of paid vacation, of simply having time to pursue hobbies, was largely alien. Your current, enforced leisure is anything but relaxing. It's the leisure of despair, the idleness of a body too weak, and a spirit too crushed to do much more than just exist, moment by moment. Your hard, short life as a medieval thief, or more accurately, a failed medieval thief, is simply a more dramatic, more compressed version of the hardships many faced. You lack the community ties, the meager security of a serf tied to the land, but the underlying vulnerability is a shared experience. The fear of hunger, the threat of violence, the powerlessness in the face of arbitrary authority, the constant awareness of mortality. These were threads woven through the fabric of medieval existence. Your story, your sad little tale of woe, is not an exception. It's a slightly more acute symptom of a tough, tough time to be alive. As the sun begins to set once more, casting long, mournful shadows through the trees, you pull your ragged cloak tighter around you. The night will be cold again. The hunger will return, if it ever truly left. And tomorrow will be much the same. A thief's life, especially a rubbish one, was indeed hard, and very often mercifully or unmercifully short. The world around you seems to soften now, the sharp edges of your recent, rather unpleasant experiences beginning to blur slightly as exhaustion, deep and profound, finally starts to claim you. The sounds of the forest, which earlier felt so threatening and full of ominous portent, now seem to recede, becoming a more distant, almost soothing hum, like the gentle, rhythmic drone of a far-off fan. The wind sighs through the leaves overhead, a sound that could almost be a lullaby, a mournful, ancient tune, carrying tales of countless others who have known hardship and found rest, one way or another, under skies just like this one. You can almost feel the chill seeping from your bones, replaced by a strange, drifting warmth that seems to emanate from the earth itself, or perhaps from some deep, forgotten wellspring of peace within you. The image of the sneering crowd in the market square, the grim face of the magistrate, even the merchant's outraged bellow, all begin to fade, like watercolor paintings left out in a persistent, gentle rain, their colors running together into something indistinct and no longer quite so menacing. Your hunger, that constant, twisting companion, seems to loosen its grip, its sharp demands quieting to a dull, almost forgettable ache. The weight of your failures, the sting of your humiliations, they all feel a little lighter now, as if a great burden is slowly, carefully, being lifted from your weary shoulders. The anxieties about tomorrow, about where your next meager crumb might come from, or what new dangers might await you on that endless, dusty road, they too begin to recede, losing their urgency, their power to torment. There is only this moment, this quiet stillness, this sense of an ending, or perhaps a deep, deep pause before a new, though as yet unknown, beginning. Allow yourself to sink into this feeling of release, this gentle ebbing away of struggle. The hard edges of your medieval reality are dissolving, the sharp stones of your path becoming soft moss underfoot. You are drifting, no longer pursued, no longer a fugitive, but simply resting. Let the darkness behind your eyelids be a comforting blanket, and the silence, or the soft night sounds, be a balm to your frayed senses. There is nothing more you need to do, nothing more to fear, at least for now. Just this quiet, this slow descent into the velvet blackness of truly deep, and perhaps finally untroubled sleep. Good night.